Sok szeretettel üdvözlök mindenkit. A mai napon kerül sor John McNamara professzor úr új tiszteletű tagunknak a székfoglalójára. Welcome all of you, and this is a dedicated day because worldwide well-known biologist, theoretical biologist, John McNamara was elected as honorary member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, would present us the inaugural speech soon, and I would say that he is a fantastically good scientist, and he is a theoretician, and he made essential contribution to the understanding the evolutionary biology, and he also applied mathematical models, so he has a very great impression to biology, generally speaking. Another issue that I would like to emphasize, that he has been collaborating with Hungarian scientists, and he has many papers, international journals, who were made with Hungarian biologists, and we would like to express our thanks for this kind of collaboration. But before we would start with this lecture, I would like to ask Szathmáry, Professor Szathmáry, to give several words about John McNamara. But anyway, I would tell you the title of the lecture. This is The Art of the State, Modeling and Endpoints of Evolution by Natural Selection. May I ask Professor Szathmáry to laudate the candidate.
Mr. President, dear Professor John McNamara, dear John, it's my utmost pleasure to give this introduction to this lecture on the occasion of his honorary membership at the Hungarian Academy. And by the way of his profession, we are going to jump now into some applied life history evolution. This is the applied life history evolution at the beginning. As you see, he was born in 1949, and he made his bachelor in mathematics. Then he switched to astronomy, and he got his doctorate from Oxford University in '77. And there came my first big surprise. Here is the surprise. Here is the title of the thesis: Stability of the Inner Horizon of the Reisner Nord Stream and Kerr Black Hole Models, 1977. Advisor, Roger Penrose. I presume he wasn't a third then. Or was he? Oh, very good, so very impressive. I understand it was a very interesting journey to undertake this, with or without the guidance of Professor Penrose. And you know, Professor Penrose got the Nobel Prize a few years ago for his works on gravitation. But then John has switched soon to some other fields, and those fields are the fields from which we are benefiting today. Here you see all his positions, the first ones at the bottom, and it goes up. He is now emeritus professor of mathematics and biology. That's already remarkable, this combination. It's not so common. In the School of Mathematics, University of Bristol. And he has spent, really a lot of time in Bristol. Actually, the weather is very conducive to concentrated work in Bristol because, there are not too much distractions there, weather-wise. But you see that he was actually also taking different positions, also as guests. I would like to single out one now. He was fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin in 2001-2002. This is remarkable because quite a few of us have been fellows there, not necessarily in the same year. I know that, for example, Tamás Székely was a fellow there. I also was a fellow there. So it's fair to say that they have dedicated quite a bit of resources to fostering theoretical biology, and they have, as you see from at least from these two gentlemen. They have excellent fellows every year. Now, John has made really very important contributions to different aspects. Broadly speaking, you know, under the umbrella of the evolution of behavior. So, for example, he showed that it is the reproductive value which should be regarded as the common currency to optimize behavior. Now, this is very mathematical. It's heavy going. I mean, it goes back to Sir Ronald Fisher, but then actually to systematically use it is very important because there was a habit of people to introducing ad hoc costs, for example, which in this term don't necessarily have a realistic meaning. Then came this idea that if you analyze life history evolution, you should also consider what is called state-dependent life histories. Then, which is again involved, the error in decision-making approach to solve state-dependent dynamical games. Now we are very much into heavy mathematics, and obviously he has made good use of his formal training throughout all his career. The general evolution of cooperation, obviously, that's not news to anybody in the room, is a very important and very hot topic. What I think John was really, has been a master of is to actually deepen our knowledge. So, because you can have coarse-grained and fine-grained approaches to various things in science, but he actually got more deeper and deeper into this, and I admire him for this work. And he also investigated the theoretical foundations of parental care. I mean, other people would make a beautiful career only just on one or two of these items in the list, but John has contributed to all of them, importantly. As mentioned before by our president of the Division of Biology, he has obviously produced a lot of publications. The Google Scholar gives a very impressive number of citations, and which is again important, already alluded to, he has 18 papers with Zoltán Barta and 9 papers with Tamás Székely. He cares for Hungarian colleagues, and we are very, very happy that we can be here with him today. He also wrote 2 important books. One is about models of adaptive behavior. The other one is a game theory in biology. Both of these books have been written by very distinguished and very thoughtful colleagues. One is Alasdair Houston, and the other is Ole Leimar. And I can just recommend these books. So if you really want to know, for example, what has happened in game theory between 1982, that John's book, the other John, Lénárd's book on evolution and theory of games, and what has happened since then you should look at this book, and this also has this conceptual clarity which I would highly recommend to follow. And as usual, if somebody is a successful scientist, then you start collecting prizes. You see that once it starts, then you can't stop it, basically. These are, very well-deserved prizes for his contributions. Now, without further ado, it's his turn to continue with the real thing of today. Just again to reiterate, the title of the inaugural lecture is The Art of the State. Good. The Art of the State, Modeling the Endpoints of Evolution by Natural Selection by John McNamara. Dear John, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks to both of you for your kind words. It's a great honor to be elected an honorary member of the Society. Thank you for coming. What I will try and do in my talk is to give you some feeling of the history, how I got into this field, and some idea of what I do, just a flavor of what I do. Thank you. So, the art of the state. If you look about you in the natural world, you will see animals performing diverse activities, some of them rather strange. It's natural to ask why they are doing what they're doing. And that is what I'm interested in, this question of why. But before I get into that, it's important to make clear exactly what I mean by the word why. It can have various meanings. So let me illustrate that by thinking of the question of why do voles avoid hawks? So here we have this hypothetical vole here that is, if I can control this, shy of this hawk up here. And the question is, why would it run away when it sees a hawk? And at one level, a mechanistic explanation is that the vole is frightened of the hawk. Now, that's perfectly true, but the question is, why does the vole have this fright mechanism? And so you can answer that at a different level with an ultimate or functional explanation, and that is that the strategy of avoiding hawks is adaptive. It increases the vole's fitness. Okay. So I should be clear exactly what I mean. By a strategy, I mean a rule for producing behavior. So run away when you see a hawk, for example, would be a strategy. I should also be clear about what I mean by fitness, and it's used very loosely in a lot of biology, but if you're a modeler, you have to give it a very precise definition. And we can think of it, at least for this lecture, as the number of offspring produced over the lifetime of the organism, or at least the mean number of offspring, the average of it. And so this statement that the strategy of avoiding hawks is adaptive, you can see it in that those voles which do not avoid hawks leave very few offspring, is the point. Okay. So, modeling adaptation in this way allows you to make predictive models about what animals will do. And the philosophy behind these models is that natural selection is ultimately dominated by animals that have strategies which have high fitness. And so mathematically what you do, you specify what possible strategies you can have within the population, what behavioral rules. Then you specify an appropriate fitness measure, which might be the lifetime number of offspring. And then you employ a suitable mathematical optimization technique to find the strategy which maximizes fitness. And that is your, if you like, prediction of behavior. And the aims is to make testable predictions, it's true, but also to understand why. Not all models, I'll come back to this briefly later on, there are very many different models one can make. The ones I make are about exposing the logic, understanding why things are occurring. Okay. So, the outline of my talk, I will talk a bit about the history, which is how I got into what are called state-dependent dynamic models. These are models which specify how behavior depends on state and time. Then I will illustrate a nice, simple dynamic optimization model by considering why do birds tend to sing at dawn and dusk. Okay? And finally, a rather different example, I will talk briefly about a parental care example I've worked on. And that will have a rather different flavor, and I want to contrast it with what goes before. Okay. So, in the 70s, it was the 70s. So, I was working in Oxford on black holes, and I would have continued working, well, I may have continued working on black holes, except next to me in the graduate center was a person called Alistair Houston, who was interested in animal behavior, came from a psychology background, and I'd never been interested in biology at school because it seemed to me to be a collection of facts which weren't related in any way, just a list. And Alistair persuaded me biology was conceptually interesting, and as a result, we started to work together at that time. So what was Alistair doing in the 70s in the zoology department? There was a lot of activity in Oxford, a lot of it was about things like the behavior of small birds. So these are foraging behavior in particular. And this was a time when what's called optimal foraging theory was developed, which predicted how animals would maximize their mean rate of energy gain, what sort of strategies they would employ. If the food was patchy, how long should a bird remain in a patch before moving to a new patch? That sort of thing. Now, all of this was okay, except all of their theorizing, it totally ignored predation. And for a small bird, predation is absolutely crucial. Birds expose themselves to predators in order to get food. So if you're thinking about predation, I mean, you can ask questions, there's a trade-off, in other words. How much risk should a bird take to get a food item? What's the maximum probability of death it should accept? Okay. Now, the problem with dealing with this particular question is that you need some sort of common currency, because you're comparing two very different things. You're comparing the value of food, which is in terms of energy, with the cost of death. Okay. So, our approach to this was to go through what is called reproductive value. And reproductive value is, the reproductive value of an individual is a measure of the ability of that individual to leave offspring in the future, now and in the future. So it depends, crucially, on the current state of the animal. If the animal is in poor condition, it won't leave many in the future. Now, the state I'm interested in here, for this particular example, is energy reserves. And so here you can see a sort of hypothetical curves, which are very difficult to control. This is interesting. Yeah, energy reserves here. And here is reproductive value, which is a measure of the number of future offspring left by the organism as a function of its current energy reserves. Now, these are hypothetical examples. I've looked at one where the lower one might be in a poor environment. If the environment's good, so there's lots of food in the future, then it'll be higher, the curve. But you can imagine both of them are increasing but then flattening off in some way. Okay. Now, what is the value of food? Let's measure it in terms of reproductive value terms. The value of food is the increase in the number of offspring that results by eating this food item. So it's the increase in reproductive value as a result of getting the item. What is the cost of death? It's the loss in numbers of offspring as a result of being killed. So it's your current reproductive value. So if you ask, is it worth, what's the probability the bird should accept in terms of the probability of death? It's worth the risk if the value is greater than the expected cost. And the expected cost is the probability of death times the cost paid if you die. So in other words, we can rewrite this. The risk has to be less than this ratio here, okay, which is the increase in reproductive value divided by reproductive value. Very simple formula. Sorry to do maths, but it is, after all, school maths. Yeah. Anyway, but the take-home message is that reproductive value acts as a common currency here. Notice you can get rather simple things and rather obvious things out of this formula. For example, because reproductive value is decelerating, the increase in reproductive value by taking of food decreases as you get higher reserves. And reproductive value itself increases. So the ratio decreases as reserves increase, and so birds should take less risks in terms of predation as their reserves go up. Well, it's not a surprising result, but it's the sort of thing that insights come out of the point. Okay. Right. So far, so good. Now, the problem is, where does reproductive value come from? How do you get it in any system? Well, sometimes you can get it from just looking at the biology in a way. But in many circumstances, you're faced with the fact that reproductive value depends on the future. It's a measure of the future number of offspring. So it depends on the future environmental conditions, but it also depends on the future of the behavior of the organism itself. How is it behaving? So that means that the best thing to do today depends on your reproductive value, but your reproductive value depends on what you will do tomorrow, and what you will do tomorrow depends on the reproductive value then, which depends on the day after, and so on and so on. So a natural way to approach these problems is, rather than working forward, is to work backwards. Okay. And so let me give you an idea. So we might have some final time, which is this capital T, which I'll call the terminal time. And supposing you know reproductive value then from either the biology, or maybe it's the end of the animal's life, in which case you know its reproductive value, it's 0. Okay, if it can't live beyond a certain time. Having found it at capital T, or knowing it at capital T, you can work out the best thing to do at time t minus 1 and what reproductive value will be then. And having found it then, you can move back to time t minus 2 and so on. And this is a standard mathematical technique called dynamic programming. And it allows you to find the optimal actions as a function of both state and time at all times before your final time. And that's what's outputted by the model. Okay. Incidentally, I'm not suggesting animals do this. This is a mathematician doing it. What animals do is they will implement a strategy like this by physiological and psychological mechanisms. So that's just a way of achieving this. I'm not suggesting they do dynamic programming. It's the modeler that does that. Anyway, so Alistair and I looked at winter fattening in small birds, daily routines of foraging and resting, and lots of other things. But I want to look in detail at an early example we did, which was working on the daily routines of singing in male birds. So here I've got 2 representative birds, if you like. Dawn chorus, yes, this is these times I've got here. These arrows are supposed to be, control this, sunrise and sunset, essentially on the 2 things. And you can see that for the wren, there is a lot of singing around dawn, often just pre-dawn and just after dawn. Then typically there's a dip in singing during the day, and then there's another peak towards dusk, although usually a lesser peak. And I've shown a similar thing for red jungle fowl there. Okay. So this is very common in birds, although their routines tend to vary systematically between different species. So what's going on here? Why are they doing this? Why do you get a dawn chorus? Well, the first thing to understand is why they're singing at all. And for most birds, they sing for 2 reasons. One is actually to attract a mate or mate guard. Another is territorial defense. They're the 2 probably main things. But I'm going to be concerned with attracting a mate. I'm going to be concerned with behavior in the breeding season, where individuals are trying to, there's a male trying to attract a female to his territory. Okay. That's why they sing, but why sing at dawn and dusk? Well, when we got into this literature, all the explanations were, if you like, very local. So, for example, one good reason you might sing at dawn is that the light intensity isn't very good, so it's not a very good time to forage. Other people said, but acoustics are better at dawn, so maybe that's why they sing there. Another explanation given, there are more females at dawn, something to do with them arriving overnight or something of the sort. There are lots of different explanations of this sort. But none of this really thought about the strategic regulation of energy reserves by these birds. The thing about certainly the small birds that people were concerned with, they starve unless they get food within often 48 hours and sometimes even less. So food is really important to them. And the thing about singing, it's not just it depletes reserves, it's usually incompatible with foraging. So when they sing, they can't forage and their reserves will go down. So you might expect behavior to depend on reserves and there to be some sort of trade-off between trying to get a mate and the risk of starvation. The more you sing, the more likely it is you're going to mate, but because the world is uncertain, the more likely it is your reserves will reach zero and you will starve. So I want to build the simplest model that captures the biology of this strategic regulation of energy reserves and try and understand what effects the strategic regulation we predict to have on behavior. I should say that I alluded to the fact that there are many different types of models. And if you're making something like a climate model, you need to put all the details in because you're interested in a detailed quantitative prediction at the end of it. That is not the sort of model I got here, and it's not the sort of model I typically tend to make. What you're interested in here, for example, in the model I'm going to present, there are lots of elements that are present in the real world which I won't put in. I'm not even going to put any predation in it. And the reason is that I want to build a model which exposes the logic of how the regulation of reserves affects behavior. There are all these other things overlaid on it, but I'm going to isolate this one thing. Okay. And to do that, I'm going to build the simplest possible model which incorporates the relevant biology. You can't make the model too simple. I don't know if Einstein ever did say the models should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's what you've got to do, build a model which incorporates the right biology to get to understand the phenomena. Okay. These models are very limited, but you have to understand what the limitations are and then what your possible extensions are. So, we have a male bird, a small male bird, trying to get a mate. It has an opportunity window of several days, which are comprised day-night cycles. During the night, it just rests. It has no other alternative. During the day, it either sings or forages. And I'm going to divide this day into an arbitrary number. It's 75. I have no idea why we choose that number. It was a long time ago. Yeah. And each interval of the day, they can either sing or forage. If they sing, there's a small probability they'll get a female. And if they forage, there's a probability they will get food. Okay? They may not get food. And these probabilities I've talked about are constant throughout the day. Now, I'm not saying they are in nature, but I want to keep them constant here because I want to see what the ramifications are of having a constant probability, whether you can still get a dawn chorus if you don't assume dawn is a bad time to forage or whatever it is. So, I'm going to model in here stochasticity, randomness, in the way energy reserves fluctuate. So during foraging, there's a probability of getting food, but the animal may not get a food item if it decides to forage. So there's that uncertainty there. Overnight, I'll assume that the temperature varies. Occasionally, there's an occasional cold night. So the animal doesn't know, the bird doesn't know whether it's going to be a cold night tonight or not. If it's a cold night, it will use more energy. Okay. So reproductive value, very simple. If the bird starves in this mating window, its reproductive value is 0, not surprisingly. If it manages to survive but doesn't get a mate, it's higher than 0, but not as high as if it survives and gets a mate. And the idea, if it survives, maybe it can get a mate next year or something of the sort. So still produce offspring in the future. Okay. So, if you do your dynamic programming, this is the strategy you get out of this model. So in this strategy, the bird either forages or sings, remember, during the daylight period. and it, not surprisingly, it forages if its reserves are low, it sings if its reserves are high. And the line between them has this characteristic shape because in the morning it sings and forages as its reserves oscillate across this line, but in the afternoon it has to build up its reserves to survive the night. And because the food supply is uncertain, there's this randomness. It has to build up its reserves in advance of the dusk, and that means typically it can let its reserves drift down at the end, and that's why you've got this curve which comes up and then goes down at the end. It's all to do with unpredictability. Okay. Now you get your computer bird, your virtual bird, to follow this strategy, and this is the routine you get. There is a dawn chorus, there's a sort of plateau in the early in the morning, then there's a dip for a lot of the day, and then there's a dusk chorus. So everything is constant throughout the day, but you still get a routine. So why do you get this? Well, let's have a look at the dawn chorus. There's uncertainty overnight, so you have to have high reserves at dusk in case it's a cold night, which means typically, well, on warm nights, you've got excess at dawn, and therefore you can sing. And you can see this in the model. The good thing about models is you can investigate the models, this why question, by looking at the details. So, for example, in this second thing, what I've done is compared the original routine with the case where the nights are colder. And if you make the nights colder, then the dusk fat levels are higher, and if the night isn't cold, the cold nights aren't, if it's a warm night, they have even more reserves and sing even more. And you can see that in the dotted line there, where the cold. Okay. So that's why we're getting our dawn chorus in this. The dusk chorus, very simple. You build up reserves before dusk. You can't leave it to the last minute. Most birds reach their target before dusk, and they can afford to sing. It's as simple as that. So here we've got a dawn and dusk chorus without assuming any time of day dependence. And you've got it by having a model which has this holistic approach. It doesn't take a particular time and take that time in isolation. What you're doing is considering the whole strategic regulation of energy reserves over this breeding period. Okay. Yeah, and I should say, I mean, results are usually obvious in hindsight, but had you not made a model of this sort, you probably wouldn't have got to that sort of thing. Of course, if results aren't obvious in hindsight, then you need to worry a bit, because have you made a mistake? Is it a computer error or whatever it is? Yeah. Okay. Now, what about the empirical evidence? Well, the good thing about this model, it at least motivated some people to actually do experiments, Rob Thomas in particular. Supplementary feeding certainly increases song, so it's certainly to do with energy. That's not surprisingly. Yeah. Overnight temperature, dawn fat reserves certainly increase with the overnight temperature, as you might expect. But the evidence, there is some evidence that dawn song increases with dawn reserves. But the whole link between temperature and singing is a little bit difficult, because what actually you do the empirical stuff and you find there are complications. And the world is always more complicated than you think. And the complications here is the birds seem to know when it's going to be a cold night, interestingly. And they can go into torpor, which obviates the need. Well, they use less energy. But then you can ask, why don't they go into torpor all the time? And that's because there are probably predation risks associated with torpor, and you get into more and more convoluted things if you're not careful. But the world is complex, but trying to expose the logic highlights this. Increasing the variability of the food supply certainly increases dusk song. If you make the food supply during the day what they do is they start to build up earlier. There's more dusk song. And actually, there typically is slightly less dawn song, which is what the model actually predicts as well. So, what have we learnt? There certainly seems the trade-off between starvation and predation. The strategic regulation of energy reserves seems to be highly relevant to these birds. They certainly respond to stochasticity. But the current model has limitations. As I said, birds can predict cold nights, they can partially compensate for the cold, and dawn may be a bad time to forage. And maybe sound does travel better there, etc., etc. So there are all these other things out there in the real world. And so what my model does is help to expose the logic, it's motivate some experiments and understand effects, but it's limited, as are all models. And in fact, if you look there is still, this is many years afterwards, the original model was, back in the 1980s, 1987. We still don't have a comprehensive account of the different species and their routines, which are highly variable, across different species. And that's because there are many factors which operate in this. In particular, something which I've left out of this, and which we worked on subsequently, is one of the reasons is that in the model, all males are the same. But in reality, probably all males aren't the same. And what males can do is to sing, the ones that sing more, show the females who are choosing them that they're good at foraging and that sort of thing. So there are all these factors. And it's not surprising, maybe, that we don't have a comprehensive account. But if you ever reach one, it will certainly have to include the strategic regulation of body mass, which wasn't there originally, as a central factor in what they're doing. Okay. Right. Further examples. Well, winter fattening, food hoarding. So these are other examples of sort of state-dependent dynamic models which I've made. Food hoarding, the interesting thing here is you've got energy reserves as a state, but you've also got the size of the current hoard, which is stored in the environment. So these are food stores. Okay. And you can make predictions about routines then and when they should hoard food and when they shouldn't. Response to infection. Your state here would be again, energy reserves might be important and various resources, levels of resources, which are used to fight infection and do things. But the current pathogen load, or some measure of it, is also a relevant state variable. And you can use these models to try and predict, for example, in a breeding season, when they should mount a strong immune response and when they don't. Annual routines of multi-migration. These are interesting. And this is, again, an example where you need a holistic approach. You're trying to think over the annual cycle. When should a breed migrate? How far should it migrate? When should it breed? Where should it breed? When should it molt? Should it molt once? Should it molt twice, etc.? Should it molt post-breeding, etc.? So how do you do that? Well, you have another state-dependent model, where the state is the current energy reserves, the fat level. You're interested in molt, so you need to include feather quality. You're interested in migration, so you need to include location. And there are other state variables we used as well, which I've left out. But you have to take a holistic approach because you're going round and round. Everything depends on everything else over this annual cycle. And dynamic programming provides that. So another example, different state variable here, is stress response. If you've got a stressor, the problem is with the presence of a stressor, you can mount a stress response, which helps to protect against the stressor, but if the stress response is too strong or too prolonged, then it does you damage, physiological damage. So physiological damage is here the relevant state variable you should be using. And these models, you can predict when they should mount strong responses and so on. Okay. So my final example is about parental care in birds. Can somebody tell me how long I've talked and how long I've got?
Just go on.
Just go on. Okay. Right. So this is work with Alistair Houston, again, who now looks a bit older than in the original slide. And it involves these two guys here, Zoltán Batra on the left, Tamás Székely on the right. This is taken in Debrecen, I believe. Yes. Yes. A lot of this was motivated by Tamás, who turned up in Bristol many, many years ago as a sort of whirlwind and got us working on this. So, parental care in birds is quite interesting because you often have, you have two parents, but there's a conflict of interest. This applies not just to birds. There's typically a conflict of interest. Both of the parents want the young to do well, but caring for young is costly, and it can be costly for a small bird. It has to go and get food, which exposes it to predators, or maybe it's an opportunity cost. Maybe the bird can desert the nest, go and find a new partner, and raise a new brood, leaving its original partner to care, etc. So there are all these costs. So each of the parents want the young to do well, but they prefer the other parent to put in the effort. Okay. And so you get a conflict of interest. Right. So this is a situation which is a game. It's a game because the best action of a parent depends on the action of its partner. The other aspect which is important for what I'm just about to talk about is that the action of one of the parents affects what the other one does, and that's crucial. So this is very different to all the problems which I've mentioned previously, where you're playing, if you like, a game against nature, and nature doesn't react against you if you do something. You decide to sing, it doesn't change the food supply. I won't go through this model in detail. I'll only just try and bring out two aspects of it which are to do with the game, which, as I said, wouldn't be, the sorts of things wouldn't be present in the examples I talked about before. So a lot of this was motivated by the penduline tit. These are quite interesting because in penduline tits, you never get biparental care. You either get care by the male or care by the female, sometimes biparental desertion as well. But you never get them both caring together. Okay. So I'm going to make a model where each parent can either care or desert, or this is the model we made. And so I'm going to write down, if you'll excuse me putting some numbers down, these are hypothetical reproductive values. I mean, you could put the numbers which come out of the computation, but they'd have lots of decimal points, etc. I'm just putting something down to illustrate the logic. Okay, so these aren't real numbers, they're just illustrative. And so, for example, if this is the reproductive value of the male in this breeding attempt, if the female cares and the male cares, the male gets, his reproductive value is 6. Right. On the other hand, if the female cares and the male deserts, his reproductive value is 5. So, given the female care, if the female cares, it's best for the male to care. Okay. Now, what about if the female deserts? Well, if the female deserts, the male can get 3 by caring and 1 by deserting. So it's best for the male to care. So you might expect male care to evolve in this system. You might. Okay. And if that is true, then if you look at, this is a hypothetical reproductive value of the female, then for this, if the male cares, the female does better if she deserts, because 7 is greater than 6. So you'll get uniparental care by the male predicted out of here. Or it seems like you might, except that typically, in many bird species, the male will decide his action before the female. And the female will then make her decision based on the male. And that's because the female has to lay the eggs. The male fertilizes the female, and then the male can decide to either stay or go. The female has to stay to start with. Okay. Right. So let's look at the pale structure we just looked at, but now assume the male decides first. The numbers at the bottom here, by the way, these numbers here, are pairs of reproductive values. The first number is to the male, the second number is to the female. Okay? So, for example, if the male decides to care and the female deserts, then the female will get 7. Whereas if the male cares and the female cares, the female will get 6. This is the same payoff as I wrote down in the previous slide. So if the male cares, the female does better by deserting because 7 is greater than 6, and the male ends up with a payoff of 3. Okay. We go on. If the male deserts, then the female does better by caring, because 4 is greater than 3. And now the male gets 5. So the male does better to desert than to care. So you get male desertion and female care, which is the total opposite of what we had before. And you get this arising. The male would prefer to care for any fixed action of the female. But the action of the female isn't fixed. It's affected by the male's decision. So the male deserts in order to stop the female from deserting effectively. Okay. So this is an example where, doing game theory, you get counterintuitive effects. Okay. Let me give you another one. So here's the original pale structure. And under this, the male deserts, the female cares, and the female gets reproductive value of 4. Let me compare that with a cost structure where the female gets a smaller reproductive value if the male deserts and she cares. It's now 2, okay? And let's consider that case. Now, if the male cares, the female deserts as before and the male gets 3. But if the male deserts, the female now, 3 is greater than 2 for the female, and so the female deserts as well. And the male only gets 1. In which case, so you've got male care, the male, therefore, does best by caring. Yeah, sorry, wrong one. Go back. The male does best by caring, the female deserts, and the female gets 7. So the whole point of this is that I've reduced the reproductive value of the female for this particular entry in the table from 4 to 2, and as a result, the female does better. Okay. Again, this is something you wouldn't have got in a simple optimization setting. Okay. This isn't a very surprising result in a way. I mean, you know, armies are sort of reputedly, at least, I mean, generals order them to burn the bridge behind you because then that reduces the options and things, and they get an advantage from that. So handicapping yourself can be advantageous. Okay. Anyway, let me go back to this model that we developed. There's a lot in this model. I'm not going to describe the details. In fact, we had the male choosing first. This was a model where you looked at a dynamic model over the breeding season. The state variables are whether you're paired, your own reserves, and the reserves of your partner, which each individually supposedly knows. If you were to ignore reserves in this, and foraging in this model, you get male desertion and female care. But if you include foraging and reserves,
then you get the opposite conclusion. You get the male cares and the female deserts. And why is that happening? Well, what happens is the female has the choice of when to forage. And what she does, she decides not to forage and let her reserves drift down. Therefore, she can't care on her own. Therefore, the male has to care. Therefore, she can desert. That's what goes on in this model. Okay. So, there's this sort of trying to expose the logic of these credible threats is one of the purposes of the paper. They're also, it's sort of compatible with some of the empirical evidence as well, but it's very difficult. But in that, for example, during breeding, individuals often do refuse food. But it's not so clear that it's for this particular reason. It's very difficult to entangle. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a sort of feeling of why game theory was different to problems which don't involve other members of the population. And well, I thought I'd say something very brief about what I'm doing now. I'm still working with games, and we're interested in things like learning in games. And the thing about learning in games, again, you've got this aspect where an individual will do things within a group for two reasons. One is to get rewards now. The other is to affect others in the future, because everybody's learning. And if they're learning something, then that will alter what they do in the future. So every time you perform an action, it has these dual things, and you can get some very strange things out. So, for example, you can get biases in preferences. Individuals should prefer things which seem nonsensical in a sense. They're optimistic or something, over-optimistic and so on. Anyway, just trying to give you a flavor of what I do. Thank you.
Yes. Inauguration speech. And may I give you your diploma? And so this is to John Michael McNamara, the Disciplina Biológiai Phylogeneticei, Sodalem honoris causa creare. Dr. McNamara, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Real honor. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good.